for the Holocaust Exhibition and Learning Center in Huddersfield. I am joined tonight by Professor Christine Hallett, who is the director for the Center of History, Culture and Memory, or CHICAM as we call it, at the University of Huddersfield. And we are also joined by our speaker, Dr. Dean Irwin, and Professor Catherine Lewis, who I will introduce shortly. And we are excited because it's just our second co-hosted Holocaust Center and CHICAM event. And this is a particularly great turnout, so we're thrilled. We're also joined tonight by my colleague Hannah Randall, who will be helping with the technical aspects of this evening. She'll also be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions, please put them there. Our event should last about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for discussions and questions, so this should be about an hour. Tonight's event will be recorded, as you can tell, and tomorrow you'll receive a link for the recording and a very short online survey. We'd be very grateful for any feedback that you might have. So tonight we have, rather unusually for a Holocaust Center, an event about the medieval period. But it's not just about battle axes and moats and Viking gold. This is an event that explores some of the earliest manifestations of anti-Semitism against Jewish communities within England. Given today's rising anti-Semitism and extremism and various hate crimes, these types of events help us to see that prejudice and discrimination have a very long history. And I think that's something we should all consider in terms of its evolution, the way it's manifested in our cultures, regardless of the time period. And because it is a medieval event, we have the great privilege to be joined by Professor Catherine Lewis, who will introduce our speaker and chair tonight's proceedings. Catherine lectures at the University of Huddersfield and is a specialist in the later medieval gender history, especially masculinity. She has written and edited a number of books, including Kingship and Masculinity in the Late Medieval England, which compares Henry V and Henry VI. She's also appeared on BBC Radio 4's program In Our Time, and more recently, her research has focused on the Crusades. Welcome, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Chelsea, for that introduction, and good evening to everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dean Irwin, our speaker this evening. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce Dean because, as we were just discussing, his first ever academic paper was actually delivered at Huddersfield at one of our excellent postgraduate conferences when he had just finished his master's thesis. Dean subsequently received a school scholarship at Canterbury Christ Church University to complete his PhD on the records generated by Jewish money lending activities in 13th century England. Dean is now an independent researcher interested in all aspects of medieval Anglo-Jewish history. And he has in fact edited a forthcoming special edition of the journal Jewish Culture and History, which focuses on new approaches to medieval Anglo-Jewry. So do look out for that when it is published. And his title this evening is Medieval English Ritual Murder Accounts and Urban History. So over to you, Dean.
Thanks, Catherine. I hope everyone can see that.
Yes, we can.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for that kind introduction, and to Chelsea for the invitation to speak at this series. I should say that despite the fact that I chose the event for the date for this event, I'd entirely missed its significance beyond it being a week on which I was on annual leave. 2nd of February is, of course, Candlemas, or the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin Mary, and it is also incidentally the date on which William of Norwich, one of the boys I'm going to be talking about tonight, was born. So it has a special significance for this paper. When I first suggested the talk in June 21, I had no sense that it might become topical. Here, I had inexplicably failed to account for the possibility that the Church of England might issue an apology for medieval English anti-Semitism and the contribution to this which was made by the Church in England. Yet this was precisely what happened last summer, with a slightly bizarre move prompted by the upcoming octocentenary of the Council of Oxford in 1222, which included several measures relating to the Jews. The most famous of these was the reiteration of the requirement that the Jews were to wear the so-called tabula, or badge depicting the two tablets of Mosaic law. And here you can see Aaron of Colchester on the 1277 Essex forest roll, and in the sort of bottom right-hand corner, you've got the badge there. The news coverage was very surprising for me for a variety of reasons, not in the least of which was that rather a lot of people seemed to discover almost overnight that there was widespread anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. Equally surprising was the fact that, had I been asked to rank the legislation regulating Jews and their activities during this period according to their significance and impact, the Synod of Oxford would have been at the bottom of my list by quite a considerable margin. It seems to have been entirely missed that by 1222, all Jews in England had purchased an exemption to wearing the tabula, so it had virtually no impact whatsoever. But this started a conversation, and I think it's a conversation which quite a few people were not prepared for. But it was interesting to see how it developed, if nothing else. And it was a short leap from the Jewish badge to that broader conversation. And I think here England does have rather a lot to apologise for, not in the least as the home of one of the most virulent, pernicious and enduring weapons in the anti-Semitic arsenal. I refer here to the ritual murder allegation, which might be familiar to some of you as the later incarnation of the blood libel. For those of you who are familiar with the German tradition, you might know of Simon of Trent, and it'd be extraordinarily useful for my purposes if you could forget about him for the next hour or so. The impact of the technological developments in the form of the printing press had a significant impact on the dissemination and belief in that allegation, and it's not really useful to view the English accounts, which I'm going to discuss, in the light of that case. In its original incarnation, the Jews were accused of abducting Christian children, who they proceeded to torture and then murder in parody of the crucifixion of Christ. And in later iterations, the Jews would also be concerned with the boy's blood, which they would use in their rituals, and in some versions add it to their matzah bread. And these tend to be continental developments on the whole. And blood is largely absent from the English ritual murder allegations themselves, although they do appear somewhat in the miracles wrought by the victims. And in that sense, although they might legitimately be called child murder accusations, I'm going to refer to them throughout this paper as ritual murder allegations. Most of them were concerned with boys, usually aged between 9 and 13, and that really sets the tone for the English ritual murder accusations. And I want to say at the outset that these are completely fictitious allegations. There's not a shred of evidence that the Jews ever committed the murders of which they were accused, and the only thing more abhorrent than the medieval accusations is their continued use in modern society, most especially by those who know better but employ the trope anyway. I also add, by way of preface, that although I will discuss the victims in terms which are akin to saints, that they weren't. Although they may have been brutally murdered, they were not martyrs to Christianity, and although occasionally called saints, they were never formally canonized. So, before getting to the substance of this paper, I'll just give some outline of the ritual murder allegations in England. The first of these was made at Norwich in 1144, when when a 12-year-old boy named William was discovered in Thorpe Wood, and that's just in the top right-hand corner outside Norwich on this map. and his body was discovered in Fort Wood on the 25th of March, 1144, having been placed there on the previous day, which happened to be Good Friday. And this is probably one of the best known ritual murder allegations, not because it was the first or was particularly different to the other ones, but because a full-length vita or life has survived for William, which is available in a wonderfully accessible translation. Oh, sorry. Oh dear. Why? Not quite sure why it's done that. Which is available in a wonderfully accessible translation by Miri Rubin, produced for the Penguin Classic series in 2014. Written in stages between 1150 and 1173 by a Benedictine monk called Thomas of Monmouth, the life and passion tells us that the Jews abducted, tortured and murdered William. And the early sections of the narrative are, he alleges, informed by a Jewish convert. And I think it's particularly useful just to consider what he has to say on that topic. And I'm going to quote from the text itself. So, quote, he told us that in the ancient writings of their ancestors, it was written that the Jews could not achieve their freedom or even return to the lands of their fathers without shedding of human blood. Hence, it was decided by them a long time ago that every year, to the shame and affront of Christ, a Christian somewhere on earth will be sacrificed to highest God. The convert goes on, we are told, to outline how the sacrificial Christian was to be chosen in a scene which bears strikingly resemblance to the annual gatherings of the Benedictine order. Again, I quote, the leaders and rabbis of the Jews who dwell in Spain at Narbonne, where the seed of kings and their glory flourishes greatly, meet together and cast lots of all the regions where Jews lived. Whichever region was chosen by lot, its capital city had to apply that lot to other cities and towns, and the one whose name comes up will carry out the business as decreed. If anybody was under the impression that global conspiracies involving Jews are a modern phenomenon, then this clearly demonstrates that that's not the case. The implication of the narrative is the entirely imagined scene is that in 1144 England was chosen as the region, and so lots were drawn in London, with Norwich being selected, and ultimately he, the boy William, was chosen by the Jews as less wise and more fitting to be mocked and sanctified in disgrace of the Lord's passion. In other words, William was tortured before being crucified, as we will see as we see in this depiction from the Church of the Holy Trinity at Loddon. And again, this is a pure fiction, but it was enduring fiction. The same accusation would be made against Jews repeatedly between 1144 and the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. Typically, the day that this happens is around Passover and Easter. In the case of William, Thomas of Monmouth tells us that he was taken to the house of a Jew on the Tuesday before Easter, was murdered the next day, disposed of on Good Friday, with the body being discovered on Easter Saturday, and then his sanctity recognised on Easter Sunday. But this is quite a brief period, and it could be much longer, which again makes the narratives all the more fanciful. The idea that a Christian boy could just randomly be held in the house of a Jew for a prolonged period before he was tortured and crucified. Harold of Gloucester, for example, was abducted on Ember Friday, so 22nd of February, 1168, and held until Passion Sunday, 17th of March in the same year. But the torture only began on the Friday, 15th of March, so held for a while, about 3 weeks, and then the process begins. And some idea of what those tortures were thought to be can be established from the Chronicle of St. Peter's at Gloucester, which details that, again a quote, they, the citizens of Gloucester, examined the scars, the burns on the body, and the thorns fastened on his head and under his armpits, and the liquid wax poured in his eyes and on his face, by carefully examining the evidence of how his hands were clenched. It was believed that they, the Jews, had inflicted on him tortures like those of being crucified. End quote. The exception to the rule that dates involved ritual murder dates involved the Passion was broken by little Hugh of Lincoln in 1255. For reasons that I'll return to later, he was the most infamous of England's ritual murder allegations, ritual murder children. According to the Burton Analyst, Hugh was abducted on the 31st of July 1255 and was discovered at the bottom of a well a month later on the 29th of August. In fairness, this latter date was the feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist, although this was probably a coincidence. In total, Robert C. Stacey has demonstrated that there were at least 13 instances of ritual murder allegations being made across this period from its first incarnation up until the expulsion. And for reasons of the draconian constraints imposed by time limit, as well as my own personal interest, I'm just going to focus on the cases of William of Norwich and Hugh of Lincoln in this paper, with support from other accounts when necessary. Although obviously in the Q&A we can branch out a bit if anyone's interested. And I should also add that I'm not an expert on medieval martyrdom, medieval saints, and the like. So I'll be approaching this topic from the perspective of a historian who usually works on financial records. And to the literary scholars amongst you, I can only apologise for what you might regard as an act of the most egregious butchery, which is about to follow. So moving on to our two case studies. I think that they illustrate well the two components which are included in all English ritual murder allegations. The first is an accusation. Although both case studies have a body, this was by no means a necessary requirement, as Richard of Devise demonstrated when he included a lengthy discussion of an 1192 ritual murder account at Winchester in his Chronicon. This seems to have been entirely fabricated, not in the usual sense of just being fictitious, but in the sense that it wasn't even prompted by the discovery of a boy's body. It literally was just randomly made up. Of course, it was no minor thing to accuse the Jews of ritual murder, given the royal protections that they enjoyed. And this is made clear by an Anglo-Norman poem of the late 13th century, which relates a story of Hugo de Lincolnia, Hugh of Lincoln, and in it, Hugh's mother, who the Burton Analyst names as Beatrice, appealed directly to the king for justice for her murdered son. And in response, the poem tells us Henry III explained that by God's pity, if it is such as you have said, then the Jews will die without mercy. And if you have lied about the Jews concerning such a crime, then by St. Edward, have no doubt that you will suffer. You will befall this. The same fate will befall you. In other words, if the Jews were found guilty of the crime of Hugh's murder, then they would be executed. But Beatrice would similarly go to the gallows if she had falsely accused the Jews of Lincoln of murder. And although ultimately the Jews were convicted of Hugh's murder, I think that Henry III's response here is illustrative of perceptions of the Jews and the king's Jews. We also shouldn't underestimate the fact that of the dozen or so accusations, this was the only one which ever received tacit support by the crown. And the kings of England were very perfectly willing to extort and exploit its privileges over the Jews, but fiercely guarded the community against others seeking to encroach on its rights, not because of any particular favoritism to the Jews, but the fact that it wanted its rights preserved. So making an accusation unfounded was a dangerous thing to do. And here I would also say that I agree with David Carpenter's work on the case when he notes that Henry was probably in so much of a hurry to get back to Westminster for the feast of St Edward the Confessor on the 13th of October. He basically abandoned or abdicated responsibility and left it to those who had an interest in finding Jewish guilt. So it's exceptional in that sense as well. And I'm going to come back to the topic of mothers later, because I think they really provide an important insight into the cases. The second feature that I think is inherent to both our cases and the ritual murder narratives more generally is disbelief. This is a point which has often been missed in modern scholarship, I think, because scholars have been so focused upon the developing idea that by the 12th and 13th centuries, the Jews were regarded as guilty of the crime of deicide, the murder of a god, and had gone from witnesses to Christ's crucifixion to active participants in it. And there is ample evidence which illustrates the hardening of Christian attitudes towards the Jews by the time of William of Norwich. As Jeremy Cohen has eloquently outlined, 12th century Europe produced more works of anti-Jewish polemic than all the other earlier Christian centuries combined, and this trend would continue into the 13th century and presumably into later centuries as well. Yet I would also say that the material was being generated and engaged with and in a world entirely separate from the world of most people, including the urban communities in which the Jews and Christians under consideration here live. And I'm sure that the academics in the audience will be able to appreciate this. After all, as a field, we generate articles and books at a rate of knots. And this is often written in a language which is inaccessible to outsiders and which often makes no or little impact beyond the academy. We do well to remember that just because a lot's written doesn't mean anyone's actually reading it. And there I'm talking about my own work, not other people's here. And this is exactly how I did characterize many of these anti-Judaic texts as well. And when you approach the issue from that perspective, the idea that ritual murder narratives were not universally believed becomes much more credible. We certainly see this in Thomas of Monmouth's Life and Passion of William of Norwich, where the people who don't believe the allegation was extensive and includes, but is not limited to, the citizens of Norwich, the Sheriff of Norfolk, King Stephen, and perhaps most tellingly of all, a significant number of monks at Norwich Priory. In other words, Thomas couldn't even convince his monastic brothers of William's martyrdom and sanctity. Similarly, the Anglo-Norman poem that details that following Hugh of Lincoln's disappearance, the rumour soon spread through the city that the child had been stolen, but no one knew the truth except Jesus Christ and the impious ones. Again, I think this is worthy of note for two reasons. First, 13th century Lincoln was not some sleepy hollow. It was a packed and busy urban community where everyone knew everyone else's business, and given that the Jewry was centred on one of the main thoroughfares through the town, the idea that an adolescent Christian boy could just be kidnapped by the Jewish community without anybody noticing is ludicrous, and the suggestion that they could hold him for a month without notice is even more so. Second, given that the ritual murder allegations were probably well known by 1255 across the country, even if they were not necessarily believed, any suggestion that a Christian child had been abducted for the purpose of torture and murder in parody of Christ would likely have been met with the utmost severity. After all, we know that in cases of sacrilegious acts, the urban community was perfectly willing to ignore the Crown's jurisdiction over and protection of the Jewish community. At Oxford in 1268, for example, a Jew had damaged a silver cross at the head of a procession. I think that was at St. Friedwig's. I didn't write it down, I'm afraid. And while the culprit got away, the citizenry seemed to have taken their anger out on the Jewish community itself. And after a short period of violence, the Jewish community was later forced to pay for the replacement of the cross, which was also much larger and better in many ways. So from the ritual murder narratives, it seems that the local community did not accept the martyrdom of the boys or the narratives of their deaths at any rate. Of course, this might be a trope which was designed to mirror biblical narratives. And by the 12th century, it was commonly taught that the Jews had been blind to Christ's divinity, and this might be being mirrored in the ritual murder narratives, with the urban community missing the sanctity of the boys, just as biblical Jews had missed Christ's divinity. But I don't think that was the case. And to illustrate that point, I'd like to draw your attention to anti-Jewish massacres of the period. It doesn't really matter which one, so let's go with the most famous, the Massacre of Shabbat HaGadol, which is to say the Massacre of the York-Jewry, which occurred on the evening of the 16th of March, 1190. On that date, the Jews were held up in Clifford's Tower, besieged by an armed force. They could not hope to hold out for much longer, so many of them opted to die by their own hand rather than those of their attackers through ritual suicide. And the following day, those who had not committed that ritual suicide were coaxed out, possibly with promises of conversion, and then hacked down by those outside once he left the safety of the keep. And as a result, 150 Jewish men, women, and children died. But I think it's also important to ask who the attackers were, or more precisely, who they were not. Specifically, they do not seem to have been the citizenry of York, but county knights and members of the rural community. And we see this mirrored in virtually every large-scale anti-Jewish attack from across the period, that Jews were resident in every large-scale attack from across the period that Jews were resident in England. Namely, they are almost never attacked by members of the urban community which they inhabited. The reason for this is relatively obvious, but is often overlooked by grand discussions of Jewish-Christian relations. That is, Christians and Jews lived side by side in medieval community. They knew each other. Their children played with each other, as the sources relating to Little Hugh of Lincoln illustrate, and that mattered a great deal. It's always much easier to hate somebody if you've never actually met them. In that sense, I think that such labels as Christians and Jews rather complicate matters, and they would have had more resonance to those outside the urban space anyway. So perhaps it might be better just to deal with neighbours. This is not, of course, to say that people don't sometimes hate their neighbours as well. I'm speaking from experience here, but as a general rule of thumb, you don't go and kill their entire community, or indeed believe in obviously fictitious and entirely libelous statements about them. This in turn serves to explain why there is virtually no evidence that the urban communities believe the allegations or bought into the cults. It was only after the expulsion of the Jews, when we're dealing with the idea of the Jews as opposed to actual living, breathing Jews themselves, that the cults begin to get any kind of traction. And both William and Hugh do rather better as cults in the 14th and to some extent 15th centuries as a result of that. Just as a brief aside, I've spent my entire academic career, such as it is, arguing that we need to stop talking about the Jews as if they were some kind of homogenous group. They absolutely weren't. But in pulling this paper together, I realised that I'm guilty of doing much the same thing for the Christians, like many people who work on medieval Jewry, and tend to treat them as a homogeneous group, which is also wrong. And in thinking about this paper, I encountered at least 5 different groups which formed the Christian in Jewish-Christian relations. And broadly speaking, these were: 1, the urban community, the neighbours of the Jews, who tended to live alongside them and thus didn't attack them or believe these allegations. 2, the royal government, who exploited them, but broadly speaking, protected them against accusations and attack. 3, churchmen who believed that the Jews killed Christ, but not contemporary children, as with the monks of Norwich Priory. 4, those churchmen who believed both, as with Thomas of Monmouth. And 5, the rural community, most of whom dealt with the idea of the Jew rather than the Jews themselves. And I think it's really interesting to think about those categories when talking of Jewish Christian relations, and to consider how much we tar everyone with the same brush, but actually we're actually thinking about a very specific section of society. So moving on. I think that one of the most common themes of the scholarship on the topic of ritual murder is the emphasis on outsiders. And I too would like to develop this theme, but in a very different way. For previous scholarship, the outsiders are the Jews, and it's easy to understand why this is the case. The Jews were the only religious minority legally resident in England, or indeed Europe at this point. They were outsiders in England in the sense that they were urban dwellers alongside a broadly rural population, and at their largest extent, at the beginning of the 13th century, the Jewish population numbered perhaps 5,000, maybe a little more, compared to a more general population of a couple of million. Yet in the urban community, I think it would be quite wrong to suggest that they were outsiders in outsiders in the concrete sense that is often implied. Here, I'd like to develop the notion of neighbours a little more by reference to the work of Sarah Rhys-Jones and Hannah Meyer, who have demonstrated that medieval English towns were not divided according to religious lines, but broadly speaking in economic ones. And in effect, then as now, you live alongside people of your economic class. Houses are still expensive in the 13th century, so the wherewithal to purchase one depends on your position in society, and they're located at better or worse sections of the town. Which again serves to mitigate the otherness that would have been experienced by Jews. And having established above that the urban community would not, on the whole, propagate the cults of the alleged ritual murder victims, and given also that the monks of Norwich and Lincoln were far from enthusiastic about their cults, and in some instances were openly hostile to the idea, external factors were the only way that they could really get off the ground. And we see this in the case of Thomas of Monmouth, whose toponym reveals that he was not of Norwich, but instead of Monmouth in the Marches of Wales. And Gavin Langmuir notes that he was probably respectably educated, whatever that means, there before transferring to Norwich in 1149 or 1150. And I think that education must have included some training on Jews in the anti-Judaic texts that I mentioned above. And we know from the Vita that he wrote, that he started writing in 1150, that the monks had not brought into William's martyrdom, although they had buried him with honour in the monk's cemetery. And the impression that one gets from the life and passion of William Norwich is that Thomas spent the next 20 years banging on about William as a saint, with the only result really being that he irritated everyone. Even the miracles that Thomas is able to attribute to William are not especially impressive in terms of either their quality or indeed their quantity, even by the standards of a 12th century local saint. And for me, this is the perfect example of the idea of the Jew versus an actual Jew. The outsider, Thomas, comes to Norwich with his preconceptions about the Jews, we'd probably only ever known through the Bible and Psalms. And that really presented the perfect conditions for the ritual murder allegation to emerge. Thomas arrived in Norwich and probably soon learned of the discovery of William's body, which had displayed signs of a brutal death. Naturally, it didn't take very long for him to put 2 and 2 together and make 53, resulting in the ritual murder allegations. But this goes back to the point that I made above. If it's always easiest to hate those you've never met, it's also that when it's also easiest to think the worst of them if you don't actually know them. And to illustrate this point, we need look no further than contemporary discussions about immigration and the migrant crisis. We see a similar trend in the case of little Hugh of Lincoln. Having received no support from within Lincoln itself, Beatrice travelled to meet Henry III as he returned from business in Scotland to beg aid, as we have seen. And crucially, the case was adjudicated by John of Lexington, an outsider, and his findings do not seem to have been welcomed by the monks of Lincoln Cathedral, not in the least because they already had a recent saint, Hugh of Avalon, who'd been canonised in 1220. And they really don't seem to have wanted a distraction to that, leaving aside guilt or not for Hugh's death. And the most explicit outsider in the ritual murder allegations really comes from the story of Adam of Bristol, who is alleged to have died in 1180. There, a drunk Irish travelling monk who was passing through Bristol becomes important. According to the narrative of Adam's death, the Jews had murdered the boy, but do not seem to have given any thought to disposing of the body. So they attempted to get a passing priest to take the body, either by trickery, and when that didn't work, by silver, to give him a decent burial, but while throwing suspicion of the Jewish community. And as with conspiracy theories through the ages, this serves to undermine itself, because according to the allegation, the ritual murder claims were part of an elaborate international conspiracy to abduct, torture, and murder a boy each year, but apparently no thought was given to the disposal of the body. I mean, it's ludicrous, and like most things, it undermines itself. And given that these narratives never seem to have taken off in the urban community, I would suggest that I'm not the only person to have noted that. And the final point that I really want to make relates to mothers. Relates to mothers, a point which I really began to think about as a result of a recent article by Miri Rubin. And given that I'm giving this paper on the Feast of the Purification, it's perhaps best to start with Mary, the ultimate medieval mother. This is not in the least because she features prominently in the life and passion of William of Norwich. William was, as I noted at the outset, born on Candlemas, and we are told that he was a devotee of the Virgin during his short but pompous childhood. And she'd be with him spiritually, if not physically, during his martyrdom as well, though not as a protector. And I have to say that this isn't representative of the English ritual murder allegations on the whole. She does not appear to any great extent in the other narratives, as far as I can tell. And that might be regarded as a little odd, given that the stories are seeking to draw direct parallels to the crucifixion of Christ. And by the 13th century, 12th and 13th centuries, visual depictions of the crucifixion had moved away from an explicit focus on Christ to give a wider picture of the scene, with Mary often depicted looking on. She's in the bottom left-hand side of this 14th century depiction. Yeah. And there doesn't seem to have been any attempt to replicate that in the ritual murder narratives more generally. And I think this speaks to the fact that when Mary is associated with the Jews during this period, it's much more commonly in relation to conversion. Indeed, the Domus Conversorum, a house of converts at London, which was established in 1232 by Henry III as a home for Jewish converts to Christianity, it was explicitly dedicated to Mary. And I should note here that I'm referring to the secular context and the invocation of Mary. I don't know about the liturgical and ecclesiastical trends. But moving from the divine to the corporeal, given that we are dealing with boys in these narratives, implicitly we are also dealing with bereaved mothers whose children have been brutally murdered, even if Jews were not responsible. And the ideas that medieval mothers did not love their children every bit as much as their modern counterparts has long been discredited. And whatever we think about the repugnant and completely fabricated allegations levelled against Jews, we should not lose sight of the fact that the ritual murder allegations include at their heart the tragic death of boys long before their time, and the mothers who were left behind to grieve them, often in the most painful terms. And I would suggest that if these accusations construct a narrative of Jewish guilt, they also construct a parallel strand of maternal guilt for having failed to protect her offspring. This must have come as an especially harsh reality for William's mother, because the boy had convinced his abductors, who were pretending to be from the bishop's household, to seek her permission to take William. She had initially refused, in terms akin to a sheep protecting her lamb from a wolf, as Rubin demonstrates, but was worn down by William's insistence and the inducement of 3 shillings of silver. And I think the significance of that has perhaps been forgotten in people forgetting that shillings were a fiction of exchequer clerks. There was no such coin in 13th century England. Instead, it was just a specific number of pennies, and in this instance, 36 pennies. So if the price of Judas betraying Christ was 30 pieces of silver, William's mother at least held out a little longer. And a similar argument could be made in relation to Hugh of Lincoln, and I don't have time to go into this at length, but needless to say, she wanders through the city crying and trying to find her child, and when she's ultimately unable to do so, she goes to the ultimate legal authority in the land, the king, begging for help, as these passages demonstrate. And if you're looking to construct a narrative of Jewish culpability and ritual murder, then these are the passages you'll choose. But there is another reading of this passage, and it's one that permeates all of the English ritual murder accounts, and that is a distraught mother desperately searching for a missing child where they'd last been seen, and when they were unable to do so, going to the only authority that might be able to help. And just as a very brief conclusion, because I'm now over time, I would just say a few words. First, I think that the medieval English ritual murder allegations have achieved a level of credibility in modern scholarship that they wholly lacked in the 12th and 13th century urban community. Indeed, until the advent of the printing press in the 15th century, it was difficult to disseminate such stories on a scale which could, the sustained scale which was required to cultivate such cults seriously. It was only when Jews were absent from England after the expulsion that these began to take hold in any meaningful sense in the urban community. And perhaps most importantly, as historians, we should do more to emphasise whether we are talking about real breathing Jews or the ideas of a Jew. And I think in a post-truth, post-Trump age, we are better placed to do that and to draw that distinction than ever before. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dean. You can already see people clapping in the audience. Really appreciate that. That was a really fascinating paper. I'll invite Catherine and Christine Hallett, our moderators for this evening, to possibly offer some comments or some questions from the audience at this point.
Do we have any questions immediately? If not, I certainly have questions, so I can start. Dean, that was fascinating. Thanks very much. And I think as somebody who has worked on saints and hagiography, I think it was a really useful reminder to us that medieval people's responses to saints cults was not uniform and universal. And I'm reminded of John Arnold's book about belief and disbelief in the Middle Ages. And as you rightly say, you know, by no means everybody took one view of whether a particular individual was saintly or whether their death should be interpreted as a martyrdom or not. I was just really struck by what you said, or the way that you drew on those ideas about neighbours and neighbourhood. And I know this partly relates to the fascinating work that you've done on the actual Jewish communities. And so I wondered actually if you could tell us a little more about that, because that's obviously a really important background to your work. So can you tell us a little bit more about those relationships you find, this idea that in fact, yeah, Christians and Jews are living together if they're sharing similar kind of socioeconomic backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, my work sort of grew out of a reaction against the idea of the King's Jews, which is often conducted on the basis of evidence from Westminster, and I sort of wanted to get back into the communities in which the Jews lived, and drawing particularly on charter witness lists. You get wonderful evidence of them working together. And there's lots of instances where Jews are just together with Christians, and in really nice ways, which I think perhaps in our rush to condemn the 12th and 13th centuries as the anti-Jewish centuries, we perhaps miss that for people living together, there was a lot of support networks and collaboration that perhaps isn't evident in scholarship, but deserves to be.
That's great, thank you. And in fact, I do now have a question here, which is from Richard M. It's a really interesting question. So he says that in English cities and towns, there are streets called Jewry. So he's interested in what that meant. And he says, was this initially ghettos or just geographical trade markers, and wonders whether this marks the difference between what he says. So he's used the word Judeophobia, although he says he's sort of, as it were, made up the word, and he apologizes if that already exists in other contexts. But so perhaps a kind of Judeophobia, which could be defined as hate to the unknown or imagined, or a form of anti-Semitism which is based on financial or envy motivations.
There's a lot to unpack there. Yes, it is an excellent question, and I wish I'd thought of it myself. So there are no ghettos in the 13th century, or at least in Western Europe. So in that respect, there's no formal Jewries, and the idea of Jewry Street or Jewry Lane is a sort of myth. At Canterbury and Bury St Edmunds, you've got wonderful examples in 12th and 13th century charters of them not being called Jewry Lane, but being called Heathen Man Lane. They couldn't work out the Latin, so they just do it in English, which is always lovely to see. But I think it also gives this impression that the there were entirely Jewish areas, and in fact that's not true. The work of Robin Mundell has shown that one house was owned by a Jew, one house was a Christian, and it's sort of after the expulsion that the streets tend to get the name Jewry and associated with Jews, just because that's the general area in which they lived, as opposed to being something which is a remnant of the 12th and 13th centuries. And I hope I've answered that question.
Another, did you want to read it out question, Catherine?
No, you go ahead, Chris.
Okay, yeah, there's a really interesting question here, which I think everyone can see as well. So you'll be able to see this one, Dean, from Elise, who lives in Toronto and is in a Dickens group. Do you know of a book or a paper that would talk about the state of the Jews in England in Dickens's time? I'm sure we mean Charles Dickens' time, and that would perhaps explain his depiction of Jews in his works.
The honest answer is no. That's very late. But there's what's it called? There's a wonderful book by Anthony Julius called Trials of the Diaspora, which takes the history of English anti-Semitism right from the medieval period to the modern, and I'm pretty sure there's a chapter on, or at least quite a long section on Dickens in there. It's an incredibly long book, and yeah, so I expect Dickens is covered in there. I think he is, but not something I know anything about.
Thanks, Dean. We don't have any new questions yet. There was a question very early on in your talk that was answered by other people in the room, which was about the 2013 newspaper cartoon you showed. So you can probably see that one as well if you look in the chat. It was, why did we see the 2013 newspaper cartoon? And then Lily and Javier both responded. I guess it was showing the same idea of blood libel in today's publications, and blood libel continues today.
Yes, particularly by those who should know better and do know better, but just chose to ignore it. And it was particularly distasteful because it did come out on Holocaust Memorial Day, which was not lost on anybody.
And we have one from Javier. When was William of Norwich canonized?
He wasn't canonized. He was only ever a local saint. But I think it is interesting to ask whom was he a local saint for. And broadly speaking, it's Thomas of Monmouth, and also the original editors of the Life and Passion of William of Norwich, Augustus Jessup and M.R. James. There aren't any. I don't think the Peterborough Chronicle describes him as a saint. I think they just say William of Norwich. So again, it's a fiction, a fiction of the account.
Well, I suppose it is just worth saying that in the Middle Ages, one didn't have to be canonized to become a popular saint. And indeed, sometimes saints were canonized and they weren't at all popular. So it was a complicated political process, in fact. And I mean, I'm assuming, Dean, that there wasn't an attempt to canonize him. Then we don't have that kind of evidence.
I've never come across any evidence of it. But again, the church records are not my strong point. But certainly there's no suggestion in the English Chronicle tradition that was an effort which was made in the 12th and 13th centuries. I think there was some business in the 17th century with little Hugh of Lincoln, and they wanted to canonize him then. But that was largely because he kept getting him mixed up with St Hugh, the other St Hugh, and thus they thought it'd be easier just to make both St Hugh, just so they could say it. And that is when canonization becomes more important as well.
There's a question from Jonathan. Does Dean have any idea about how many debts to the Jews were actually repaid as a generality? We read about so many knights at the time who managed to avoid repaying their debts.
I think in the main, debts were repaid. It was only in exceptional circumstances that they weren't, and because they were exceptional, they appear in the records. But on the whole, debtors seem to have always repaid at some point, even if it did take rather longer than either the debtor or the creditor would have liked.
Mm.
Brilliant.
I think that might be all our questions.
Might be all the questions.
Mhm. Oh, hang on. No, sorry. No, Florence. In the Jews in medieval Normandy, Norman Golb lists many villages inhabited by Jews in rural Cotentin. I was wondering whether there were similar examples in England you might know of.
That's a slight point of debate, but yes, certainly Robin Mundell found lots of evidence of Jews in places which weren't traditional Jewish centres of occupation, or rather weren't large urban communities. Doncaster is a particular favourite of mine, and he gathered all those in the appendix to his book England's Jewish Solution. But I'm not sure that is actual evidence of inhabitation. I think it's just that they occasionally went there or dealt with those areas, debtors in those areas more frequently.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. And I think we just have time for this one quick question. Were these false accusations that you've been talking about used as justification for the expulsion?
No. Is the easy one?
That was a quick one. Yeah, thank you.
Well, Dean, we've had such educational and very interesting last hour. Thank you so much for your time. And presuming nobody has any more questions, everyone that's here, yes, thank you. Well, we're going to thank Dean in a second. But as I mentioned earlier, tomorrow we're going to send out a recording with a short link for the survey, which you can also find in the chat right now. If you could complete the survey, we'd be so very grateful. Thank you, Hannah, for sharing that link. And please remember that we have loads more of HSFA CHICAM joint events planned for this coming spring. You can follow us, CHICAM, on Twitter, where we have lots of events, and you can also come to the Holocaust Center's events page, which Hannah will also be sharing. So thank you very much to our speaker, Dean, for contributing your time and speaking with us and telling us all about this really interesting chapter of history. And to Catherine for chairing the event and for adding her input, and Christine, of course, and to Hannah as well. Thank you so much for everything. And without further ado, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and thanks so much once again.